Let's start by going to some financial institutions that should be present in every society. So there are three types of financial institutions in a society. The first one is a depository. So depository is basically any institution that provides loans. An example of this would be the bank. So it's any institution that lends you money and or has the capacity to lend you money. So an example would be a bank, of course, because banks can lend you money, but that's not the only example. There are other examples of institutions that are able to loan you money if you need so. The second type of financial institution is contractual. So a contractual financial institution is basically one that operates around a signature. So it's any institution that provides you money or you're making some kind of a financial deal with. So an example would be a pension fund, because for a pension fund, you're you're trying to sign a contract with them, and you're trying to get money through signing a contract with them. So as you can see here, an example would be a pension fund, but there are also other funds such as insurance companies. These would all be contractual institutions because you're all signing something that enters you into an agreement with them. And the last type of institution will be an investment institution. So an investment institution is any kind of institution that uses money to invest in other companies. So an example of this would be an investment bank. An investment bank is basically a bank that you can invest in for them to invest in more money. It's really just a cycle because you're investing in the bank or the company, if you want to call it that way, and the company is using their professionals to decide what companies to invest in for the maximum amount of profit. So and then after they make money, well, hopefully they make money with the money that you invested, then you can have some of the money that they made. So this is an investment fund. Let's move on. The next, so this is just a practice problem. Identify the category of each institution, and I will give just a minute for this. Okay, so I will explain each one. So for the first one, Morgan Stanley would be an investment company. So let's look back at the definition of an investment institution or a company. The definition is any company that invests. So Morgan Stanley would fit the first category. Bank of America would be the first one, which is a depository. Yes, because you're depositing your money there, you're putting money there, and they can also give you loans. So a depository is basically just a regular bank, and the Boston Investment Bank would be an investment institution, the same as the first one. I'm not going to go into the other ones at the bottom because they're somewhat repetitive, and some of them are in the same categories because in the real world, some of these categories are more common than some of the other ones. The next section of the class is the government. So, although in a capitalist society, you're supposed to be able to do business for free, and you're supposed to be able to freely conduct business operations, the government can still regulate parts of the business, no matter how free or how capitalistic your society is. And the reason behind this is because the government wants to make sure that the country is winning in terms of international competition. So that's the reason why, even if in a capitalist society, the government does not really do that much normally when you're conducting your business, they still get really involved within the business when you are competing with other countries. So here are some of the measures that they do, and you hear about the news saying talking about trade wars all the time. And here are some of the ways that they conduct trade wars. So the first way that they conduct a trade war is through protectionism. So protectionism is basically any kind of action. It's an umbrella, or it's a very broad term that describes any kind of action that helps local firms outcompete foreign firms. So all of the things that are included below, like tariffs, trade wars, and subsidies, these all are acts of protectionism. And the point of any kind of governmental policy for the economy is to protect local firms. And yes, it's kind of unfair if you're not a local firm, because the government of the country that you're operating in will always prefer their own firms compared to firms in other countries. So let's give some examples of protectionism. What exactly does protectionism look like? The first kind is called a tariff. So a tariff is basically a tax on imports. What is an import? An import is basically any product that is not produced by manufacturers based within the country. So if you're buying something from another country, then that would be an import. And what does a tariff do? A tariff basically places a tax on importing. So using my favorite example of an ice cream store, if I wanted to import ice cream from, let's say, Germany, then if there were a tariff, then that means that I would have to pay a tax for me importing, for me buying the ice cream from Germany. But if I bought it from another company based in the US, then I would not have to, or I would have to minimally pay taxes. So the comparison here is, if I were buying it from another country, then I would have to pay taxes for the fact that I'm buying it, and I will have to pay more of the tax than what I would have to pay if I didn't buy it from a foreign country, but instead bought it from a local brand. And the advantage behind this is very obvious, because it encourages companies to support brands of their own country compared to other countries, because no business person wants to be paying taxes. So that means that the foreign firms will not get much uh, revenue within the country that the company is operating in. So that means that they will make less money and they will have to leave eventually. That's the goal of the government. The next form of protectionism is a trade war. A trade war is basically a more complex term than the other ones. It's basically different countries all implementing these measures of protectionism. So this works both ways. Well, not only both ways, but every single country can use these tactics. So if you try to make it harder for my businesses from entering your country, then I can also make it hard for your businesses to enter my country. And now we're having a trade war. And trade wars can be small ones or large ones. Small ones are usually just focused around a particular industry that is particularly competitive, whereas large trade wars can have large amounts of implications. And this is not written here because it's kind of far away from the concept of finance. But one type of protectionism that's extremely, extremely extreme as a part of a trade war is an embargo. So countries rarely do this because this hurts both countries. But an embargo is basically when a country completely bans another country from doing business with the country. So an example would be if, let's say, if the United States banned business with Germany, it placed an embargo on German goods. So what that means is that now, no matter what industry you're in within the US, you're not allowed to buy products from Germany because doing business transactions with Germany has now become an illegal activity. Obviously, this is just a really extreme example of a trade war again, because most times it's less extreme than that. It's sometimes it's only one industry, sometimes it's some form of making it harder for companies to come into the country, but it's really a full ban on countries coming in. So you can still come in if you're willing to pay the extra taxes. The last I mentioned here is a subsidy. So sometimes, although the government it doesn't do anything to make it harder for the foreign brands, it helps domestic brands do business. So how do they do this? They basically grant money to local firms. Yeah, and yes, the government is giving money freely without any cost to local firms. And although it's not always just free money, sometimes it takes the shape of other forms such as tax deductions and all kinds of benefits. But the general idea is the same. They're trying to help their own companies make money. They're trying to help domestic brands out compete foreign brands because these benefits are not available to foreign brands. So if only domestic brands have these benefits, if only domestic brands have the ability to make more money, then the foreign brands would have to leave. And that, frankly, is the key purpose of protectionism. And as you can see, just to point out one pattern, a lot of these policies have to do with increasing taxes. And I'm just pointing that out because it's going to be important in later lessons. And you might be asking, who exactly is behind all these policies? Who's going to implement these policies? Well, the answer is the Federal Reserve, known as the Fed. So the Federal Reserve is an institution that basically monitors all facets of American economy and American companies doing business. It's basically the regulator of all this. And as you can see, this is the headquarters. It's a very majestic building. Its key purpose, as I said, is to regulate monetary policies. So a monetary policy is basically anything relating to the economy, and I will give a more precise definition later in this lesson. But for now, it's just anything to do with the economy. They also protect consumers. Of course, they only protect the consumers of the country that they're based in. So, and one way of protecting consumers is that they examine products and they make sure that the economy is doing well, and they will try to fix the economy, which is the next one. So they set the interest rates for everyone. So the interest rate, it's a very complicated idea and it's very advanced. So for now, I will just provide a basic definition. The basic definition is the percentage of the loan that is charged. So when you're going to the bank for a loan, a depository institution, as we learned before, you're going there for a loan. Well, the bank has to make money too, right? But how do they make money if they're giving you the money? So what they do is, yes, they are giving you money, but they make sure that you're paying a percentage of the loan that they're giving you, so that at the end of the day, you even though you will get money, but you're still going to be paying them more than the amount that they're giving you. It's just that they make it more manageable for you to pay. It's usually monthly and yearly. There are different options. So that's the interest rate. But the Federal Reserve has the power to set the interest rates for everyone. And don't get it confused with banks, because they don't have the power to go into the banks and force banks to reset their interest rates. But what they can control is what's called a general interest rate. So the general interest rate is basically this interest rate that's seen as basically the standard for all interest rates. And the reason behind this is because there's no law requiring it, but it's because it's the rate at which the banks can exchange money with each other. So as the money flows around the economy, different banks, they pass the money to other banks. Whether they want or not, the money is passed because money keeps flowing as at each payment, right? So they set the interest rate for this flow of money, what percentage has to be taken out. And if the bank has to pay a certain amount for getting the money as a part of the interest rate, then they will also have to change their own interest rate to make sure that they're still making money and they can compensate or recompensate for that interest rate that they have to pay. And the reason why this is important is because in times of trouble, such as the Great Depression or any kind of minor recession, a lot of people will want loans, right? So they will want loans because they're losing money. But if the interest rate is too high, then they wouldn't be able to get the loan because they can't pay the interest rate. And banks have a way of telling whether or not you'll be able to pay the interest rate. So the Federal Reserve essentially makes that process easier by either increasing or lowering the interest rate depending on what time it is and whether or not the economy is doing well. But their chief objective is that in the case of a recession, they make sure that you're able to get loans and you're basically able to be benefited by their policies. And as I said, their final purpose is to regulate the money supply. This essentially is how they can do all the things mentioned above. The Federal Reserve, it doesn't directly have the power to change these things that are required by law, but they do have one key power that allows them to play those roles, and that is they decide how much money is printed. They decide how much money should go into the economy. And why is this important? Because if you think about it, the study of economics is basically about the economy, right? And what does the economy rely on? What is the chief idea of the economy? It's money supply. It's how much money is available inside the economy. If they print too much money, then it's going to lead to inflation. But printing money could be beneficial during times of the Great Depression because you need to fund social programs to help the unemployed. So they basically determine this, and it's a very complicated idea in economics because the money supply, it goes through many different rings and it keeps flowing. So it's essentially a dominoes effect where one domino knocks down another domino. And the reason behind why the Fed is important is because the Fed is that the first domino piece that can cause everything to knock down. So they're the first stage, and they can control whether or not the next piece should be knocked down, which in this case means whether or not the next piece should get a certain amount of money. The next section is the difference between monetary and fiscal. So this is just a clarification section between two keywords. And these keywords, they sound really similar, but there's actually a difference between them. So a fiscal policy is a policy about how much money the government should collect. And most of this is through taxes. So you can interpret this as mostly being the rate at which tax is charged. So how much of your income should go to taxes each year. And this is actually a really controversial topic, and this is basically the reason why fiscal policy rarely changes despite what politicians promise, because it's really controversial because it's about how much people should be charged for a certain amount of money, and how much money should come out of each demographic group's income. And it's understandable because no one would want a large portion of their income to go away just because of taxes, right? So every single time a politician tries to change this, there's a huge amount of debate because no one wants to be the person where the fiscal policy decides that more money should be collected from them. The monetary policy is the size of the supply. And as I was said, this is the concept that was in the previous slides. It's basically how much money is within the economy or how much money the government decides to print. And this is useful for times such as the Great Depression, when the government needs to be able to fund social programs. So one way that social programs work during the Great Depression is they basically hire you to do some kind of work, and then they can give you money, right? But the only problem with this is during the Great Depression, if every single person is poor, then there isn't enough circulation of money within the economy. Because if you're poor, then you wouldn't be able to buy things. And if you wouldn't be able to buy things, then you wouldn't be able to contribute more money into the economy. And if this was happening at the scale of the entire population, then everyone wouldn't be able to contribute to the economy. So how did the government fund these programs if no one is getting money? The way that they fund these programs is essentially through changing the monetary policies, which is how much money should be supplied. So during the Great Depression, they essentially create different kinds of social programs. So essentially, they're basically feeding money into the economy with these social programs because they're not getting money, but they're still somehow coming up with money. And the last factor that's related is stabilization, and this is the purpose of the above two factors. So stabilization is basically to ensure that prices remain stable. As you can see during the inflation, as we learned before, if inflation increases, then prices also increase. So stabilization means that you're trying to keep prices the same and you're trying to prevent it from increasing. I'm not going to go into exactly how this is done because it's a really complicated issue because you have to find the middle point where you are pumping money into the economy during a Great Depression, but you're also not increasing it so much that it's leading to inflation. But for now, you just have to know that it's anything the government does that tries to keep prices consistent. Speaking of the Great Depression, when things go wrong, there are actually many different kinds of economic troubles. The first kind is a depression, which is the thing that everyone is the most familiar with. And it's actually funny that this is the word that you hear the most because it's actually not, it's actually just the worst kind of economic trouble, but it's not the most common because thankfully it's not the most common because it's a deep recession, meaning that it's really hard to get out of this recession, and the impacts of this recession are extremely big, affecting a lot of people all around the world. So what is a recession? A recession is basically a time of the economy where output decreases. It's basically about how much money the economy is able to make and how much revenue is able to be generated. And that's the reason why recession is measured by the output, because if the economy isn't able to generate so much money anymore, then that means that the economy is not doing well. If the economy is not able to produce so much anymore, then that means that the economy is failing. A recession could range from 1 year to 5 years, I would say would be an estimate, but there's no commonly agreed length in terms of time for what counts as a recession. In fact, I would say that there's a huge gray zone, and it's a submodel between depression and recession. There's no clear middle point. It's all about what economists decide to call it, but the two generally form the same category of the economy not producing enough, not having enough GDP. And a common phenomenon during depression and recession is uh, cyclical unemployment. So what's cyclical unemployment? Cyclical unemployment is basically this negative cycle where because businesses don't have money during depression or recession, right? I'm just gonna use the word recession because that's more common. So they don't have money during a recession, so they can't hire workers because hiring workers they will need to pay those workers money, right? But which they don't have. So that leads to an increased amount of unemployment. So the unemployment rate increases because businesses are not hiring, and if the unemployment rate increases, then these workers will not be able to have money because if you're not working, if you're not having a job, then you can't be paid, which means that you can't be rich, right? So if they don't have money, then they can't buy things, which means that they can't support businesses. And the cycle goes all over again. It's basically the cycle where businesses can pay. So that means that people can have incomes. So that means that people can buy things from companies and make them able to pay. So and this is what I mean when I say that when you're studying economics, you start to realize that all factors of society are actually interconnected, meaning that all parts of society affect one another. There's no truly independent form of institution or organization within the economy that's completely unrelated to anything else, because every single step in the economy is related to something else. So if one step fails, then that's going to trigger a whole chain of events, and that of course is not good. Okay, so after that long explanation or rant or whatever you want to call it of the economy, how do we actually evaluate the economy? The ultimate way to evaluate the economy is through the gross domestic product. So what is the gross domestic product? The gross domestic product is essentially the total value of all goods produced. So what exactly does this mean? If you think about it, the point of any company is to produce money, right? And it's also to produce some kind of product. Let's go back to the example that I'm so excited about of the ice cream. The product that I'm producing is number one, money, but also I'm producing ice cream, right? So in this case, the GDP would be a measure or gross domestic product, which is abbreviated commonly as GDP. It's basically the value of the ice cream that I'm producing. And if you take this on to a greater scale, then what that means is that you're counting that amount, the value of products of every single company in the entire economy. And there's a type of this, which is the real GDP. So the real GDP is basically the regular GDP, adjusted to all kinds of economic factors. So the real gross domestic product adjusts the values to inflation, because different countries have different exchange rates. Currencies are not worth the same. So they make all of these conversions to make sure that every single country is on the same scale. And another type of this would be GDP per capita. So per capita basically means per head. What exactly does this mean? If you think about it, every single person has one head, right? So that's the reason why per capita means per person. What is figuratively means per person. So that means that it's divided for person. So it's basically how much worth or how much value of the product does each person within the entire country produce. And the formula behind this is real GDP divided by population. And this scale, it's not. There has been a lot of debate and controversy around how accurate this is. With many economists, most economists actually say that the GDP per capita is outdated and it's not really that reliable anymore. So a lot of economists are saying these things because somehow the average person inside a country produces a certain amount of value, it doesn't mean that every single person produces that value, right? But this is just one way to measure it. Okay, so here's just an example problem. What is the GDP per capita of the following family? Number of people, 5. Amount produced, 120,000. So GDP, gross domestic product per capita. I will just give a minute to answer in the chat. Okay, so that was a minute. So I will get into the answer. The answer is 24,000 because obviously this is really unrealistic because hopefully there's no child labor going on within this family. But if you look at the formula here, it's basically real GDP, and GDP is basically the amount of money that's produced, the amount of value that's produced divided by the population. So the problem already says that the total amount of worth produced is $120,000, and the amount of people within the family is 5. So if we plug it into this formula, then it will be 120,000 divided by 5, and the answer will be $24,000. So what this means that supposedly, assuming that every single person produce the same amount of money, and that's extremely unlikely again within a country or even a family, but that means that every single person will produce $24,000 in terms of the value that they produce. Oh, and one final thing on this topic is sometimes you see GDP per capita being equated to the average income. This actually is not accurate because GDP per capita isn't necessarily the income, because it's about how much money you can actually produce, not how much you get paid. So although there is some kind of causation between the two, they're not exactly the same, because hopefully you're working in a company where the amount of money that you bring in for the company is at least similar to the amount of money that you get paid for. And now the second method is the PPP, or the purchasing power parity. I know economists just like to abbreviate a lot. So what's the PPP? The PPP is basically the purchasing power of a currency. So it's how much a currency is able to buy. What does that mean? Well, there's something called the exchange rate, right? It's about how much of one currency you can use to get a certain amount of another currency. So an example of this would be, let's say for the United States and China, right? So $1 is not equal to one Chinese yuan. So because there is a certain degree of inflation that makes the two not the same. So that's the reason why $1 may be equal to 5 Chinese yuan, or depending on the time within the economy and the economic trends of each country, the rate changes all the time. And so that's the purchasing power of the respective currencies. And why is this important? Why does this show how good the economy is? Because how much your currency is able to purchase basically has to do with inflation. Remember when I said during, I think that was our first class, that inflation is basically when money's not worth that much anymore. Just think about it. If $1 or whatever of one currency is equal to something else of another currency that's a greater number, then that means that that currency has more inflation because they're able to purchase less. It also shows the strength of a currency. So that means that if you are a country, you want your currency to be lower in terms of the exchange rate. You want your citizens to be able to say something like, with one of our currency, we're able to exchange 100 of that currency. You want your citizens to be able to say that, because that means that at least in terms of the numbers, the prices would be lower. You wouldn't have to pay as much, and the money is more quote unquote productive because the money is able to buy things with, or efficient with, if you will, with a less amount of money. So let's examine this graph at the bottom here. This basically shows that how much it costs to buy a bottle of cola or Coca-Cola or whatever drink this is in every single country. So as you can see, it's different for each country. In some countries, it's more expensive than others, but you can ignore the adjusted one, because for the adjusted one, this has nothing to do with the purchasing power because it's not their own currency anymore, so it doesn't show anything. But just look at the top column, which shows the prices in their own currencies, in their native currencies. If you can see, the European Union currently has the lowest inflation, at least in this scenario, in this graph, because they have the highest purchasing power because they're able to purchase with the least amount of money. The United States second, and so on. Next topic. So another way to evaluate is through the consumer price index. What exactly is the consumer price index? The consumer price index is a measure of how much it costs for consumers to buy certain goods. And this is not any particular goods. It's housing, apparel, transportation, education, communication, other goods and services, recreation, medical care, food and beverages, and so on. It's basically anything that you would like to buy. And the economists basically take that, condense it within a certain index of how expensive on average it is to live inside that country compared to other countries. And of course, you want your index to be low because that means that you have higher livability, at least from the perspective of the government, because that means that your citizens are able to live without having so much money. They don't need to have so much money to be able to live comfortably, and of course that's a good thing. There's more to this than that, but that's just the most basic overview. And here are just some other methods to evaluate how successful an economy is. The first one is unemployment, because obviously you want people to be able to find jobs within your country. So it's measured as a percentage of the total working population. So depending on your labor laws, sometimes it's 16 years old. Sometimes it starts from 18, depending on what institution you're looking at this stats or statistics from. But anyways, it's basically a proportion of what percentage of the population is currently struggling to find a job compared to the total population, which would be 100 if you did it through percentages. And there's actually a relationship between wages and businesses, because if the wages went too high, then businesses would hire less, which is the reason why it's really foolish to say things like, oh, and I make this mistakes. I've made it before too. If we just make businesses pay more to the workers, then other workers will be living better lives. Because just because you increase the wages, it doesn't mean that the workers will actually get that money, because the way that the businesses will try to outcompete or try to handle those wages is by hiring less. Because if you were a company and the wages that you have to pay, the minimum wage went up, then it's creating trouble for you. It's making it harder for you to pay your workers. So you're going to hire less workers, right? We move on to the next factor, which is the well-being index. So the well-being index is essentially a measure of how good your citizens' lives are. And I know that there are many, this is kind of hard to measure, especially if you're just condensing it into a numerical number. But it basically takes into account a lot of factors like life development index, life expectancies. And the reason why this is tied to the, oh, and it also includes the GDP per capita and the income. Anyways, the reason why it's tied to the economy is because how well you can live is directly related to how well the economy is doing. For example, if you were an average Joe, then you wouldn't be living too good of a life if the economy wasn't doing well, right? That's the reason why everyone hopes that the economy does well, because our lives are directly connected to the economy. Another way to look is through foreign direct investment. So foreign direct investment is essentially how much money foreign firms decide to invest into your country or business based within your country. This basically shows how well your businesses are doing. Think about it. If you are an investor, you don't want to basically be throwing money into the trash, right? So you will want that the business you're investing in is doing well. When you invest in a company, you're showing that you trust the company to do well. And if the companies of other countries trust the companies within your country, although sometimes it may just mean that they were misguided, but if there's tons of investment going on, direct investment, not just indirect, they're straight up giving money to the company, not just helping passively, then that means that they're convinced that the companies within your country are actually doing well. Excuse me, the companies within your country are doing well. The last one is through productivity. So the productivity is how much is produced compared to the resources needed to make that. Productivity within economics, its economic meaning is related, but also kind of different from its meaning in everyday life. So within everyday life, you would say things like, ah, my productivity is so low right now. I didn't get anything done. In economics, it's measured by the total amount of resources, so the cost, it's normally the cost compared to what you're producing. Or the other way around. So the monitoring costs of what you're producing. And you want productivity to be as high as possible because that means that you're using your money correctly and you're allocating funds correctly and you're putting your money in the right baskets and you're hiring the right workers. So next slides. Okay, this is another clarification just to go on a tangent a bit to clarify something. The Human Development Index or HDI is not the same as the Gross Domestic Product or GDP. These are all acronyms that all economists love because economists just love acronyms. So the short answer is yes, there is a difference between the two. The two of them are different. The HDI, you can think of it as a more concrete measure of how good your life is compared to the GDP. Because just because you're producing a lot of money, you're producing a lot of value as an economy, it doesn't mean that the average Joe or the average citizen, not to be cliched, is living a good life, right? Because there are too many other factors that could influence how good of a life you live, such as unemployment, crime. But however, I will say though, the HUI does include the GDP per capita, not the total GDP, but it includes how much value is being generated per person. The last concept on in terms of the class would be just to clarify something that I don't think I went over sufficiently before. So remember when I was talking about the GDP and the GDP per capita? The GDP per capita is a more specific part of the GDP, and it's actually a better indicator of individual wealth compared to the GDP in total. So that's another function of it. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear to everyone because I just realized I didn't really go over that before. And if there are no other questions or concerns, I will see you next week.